ladies and gentlemen. We will start, but before we do, I have a couple of announcements. First of all, Miss Darlene Blackburn will present a master dance class as artist in residence on March 3rd and March 4th at 2:30 p.m. in the Women's Gymnasium and at 7 p.m. in the Black Cultural Center. Some of you may recall having seen Darlene Blackburn's dance troupe here last year, I think, last semester. The second announcement is that on March the 27th, here in Fowler Hall, Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam will speak on the topic, the black student. Tonight we enjoy the privilege of being able to listen to a truly talented and gifted poet. Her poetry reveals both private and public perceptions of her black self. In creating images of these perceptions, she asserts not merely her black womanhood, but the essence and totality of all black people. Through her strong, vibrant, and undulating movements, we are led to a deeper understanding of our generic and historic blackness. In the words of the poet Don L. Lee, we look on her and are renewed, positively renewed. Brothers and sisters, Sister Mari Evans.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening to share some poetry and some thoughts about poetry. Can you hear me in the back of the room? If there's someone who can't hear me, would you show a hand so I can tell? Okay, thank you. Black poetry. Yeah, if you would move up closer, it would be nice. Black poetry, which proliferated in the 60s, did not begin with the 60s. African historians remind us that black men in Central Africa invented writing, a writing that was quite different from the hieroglyphics of northeastern Africa, a sophisticated system of writing that had two-syllabic signs, a 23-character alphabet, which included 4 vowels, and had spaces between the words. It should follow as no surprise that we have a black literary tradition that is over 3,000 years old, a written literature that began on the continent of Africa at least as early as 1350 BCE, according to Dr. Ben, that's before the Christian era, and that our written literature can be documented. Let me read you a few lines from a poem that has become a classic written over 3,000 years ago by one of our earliest black writers, the pharaoh Akhenaten. A black man historians describe with obvious repugnance as ugly, as having thick, pendulous lips, and a protruding jaw. Brilliant husband of the African beauty Nefertiti, his father and grandfather had been conquerors, and he owned all of that northeastern area of Africa known as Egypt. He appears to have been the first great ruler in history to combine absolute power with absolute compassion, and he was infinitely political in ways that were too sophisticated for his time and too sophisticated for ours. His continuing goal was to improve the quality of life for his people, and one of his weapons was poetry. He wrote the classic Hymn to the Sun in an effort to move his people from a worship of many gods to the worship of a single deity. Just a few lines from this poem written over 3,000 years ago by a black man. Thou appearest beautifully on the horizon of heaven, thou living Aten, the beginning of life. Creator of seed in woman, thou who makest fluid into man, who maintainest the son in the womb of his mother, who soothest him with that which stills his weeping. Thou nurse, even in the womb, who givest breath to sustain all that he has made. When he descends from the womb to breathe, on the day when he is born, thou openest his mouth completely, thou suppliest his necessities. When the chick and the egg speaks within the shell, thou givest him breath within it to maintain him. When thou hast made him his fulfillment within the egg to break it, he comes forth from the egg to speak at his completed time. He walks upon his legs when he comes forth from it. That's just a portion of the classic Hymn to the Sun, written 3,000 years ago by a black pharaoh. Lyrical, a spiritually inspired praise song, designed political intent, designed to move his people from one level that he felt was exploitive and non-productive to another that was constructive. Akhenaten understood, and I think I should add this, understood a formless single energy force, but he needed a symbol that he felt his people could relate to, and so he chose the sun. If we had more time, we could look more closely at Akhenaten, at his committed creativity, at his commitment to creativity, both part of the same fabric. And there is no way we can even casually mention the significant and brilliant contributions of a long line of competent writers of African descent. You know, some of us feel that black poetry began with Phyllis Wheatley or with Don Lee or with Imam Baraka, and that's why I feel that this kind of preface is important. World literature reflects the input of Africans who encountered and participated in the social and political systems of Asia, of the Caribbean, and of Europe, as well as of North America. We extol with pride a list that includes Aesop, the black slave from Carthage, whose writings have influenced Western philosophical thought and morals, through the efforts of celebrated Western philosophers such as Socrates, who avidly studied his works, translated them, and proclaimed the wisdom of his teachings. Socrates, you know, spent his last days translating Aesop, the Carthaginian slave. We could mention Pushkin, direct descendant of the African conqueror Hannibal, who, if you remember, styled across the Alps on elephants. Beloved in Russia as a father of Russian literature. Or we could point with pride to the prolific writer Alexandre Dumas, to his son, the young Alexandre Dumas, to whom the French theater owes so great a debt. Or to Terence the African, an early black playwright who initiated theatrical conventions and prototypes that are still a part of Western drama. The list of influential and competent North American black writers is overwhelming and certainly too long to attempt to introduce. If we had time, we could look at Miss Lucy Terry, who watched while the settlement in which she lived was destroyed by the Indians in 1746, and who, with a certain political clarity, recorded the event in poetry for posterity. The artist is a product of his time, and his experiences during the time in which he lives shape his personality and determine the nature of his material. It is impossible to properly examine black poetry without considering certain basics: the poet's purpose, his audience, and the social and political climate of his times. It is most important that we examine the social and political climate of the black writer in relationship to the social and political climate of the larger audience, for they are rarely the same experience, but rather components of the same experience. And it is this specific experience that has powered our black poetic tradition, and it is this specific experience that powers contemporary black poetry. This man, this woman who rails and screams and cries out against society, who are they? Ted Jones says, if you should see a man walking down a crowded street talking aloud to himself, don't run in the opposite direction, but run toward him. for he is a poet. You have nothing to fear from the poet but the truth. What is a truth? Is there a black truth and a white truth? Categorically no. There is the truth of the black experience, and then there are black and white reactions to that truth. The poet's initial stance is rarely absolute. The poet begins to write because there are things that he must say and there is no one to hear him. His most serious concern then, and so it should remain ideally, is who am I? No naive esoteric query, but a basic urgent inquiry that demands a considered answer. For until an individual has recorded his answer with all of its ramifications, he has no productive direction. He is like a traveler in a country that has no east rising sun. The poet is initially concerned with probing his depths, because the nooks and crannies of his being do not yet belong to him. He is like a curious child, probing with his stick in an ant-hill. Unlike the child, he records both his search and his findings. I know with pain, this is a poem of search entitled Conflict. I know with pain the me that is, and I inbreathe this anguish deep upon my heart. I keen and flail behind my tight-squeezed lids, much too aware to stay and seemingly unable to depart. And this is the silver cell. I have never been contained except I made the prison, nor known a chain except those forged by me. Oh, I am slave and I am master, am at once both bound and free. In time he learns that he is not enough for himself, and he begins to step sidewise, suggesting his new emptiness to those who will meet his eye. If there be sorrow, let it be for things undone, undreamed, unrealized, unattained. To these add one, love withheld, restrained. Here, hold my hand, let me touch you. There is nothing we can say. Your soul eludes me when I reach out, your eyes resent my need to know you. Here, hold my hand, since there is nothing we can say. In due course, he will discover the people. They have been there all the time, and they are no different now than before, but he does not know this, for he has changed. He has opened to their misery, stepping outside himself to become the people. Now he wears their shoes, sits at their table, understanding indivisibility as truth. He cannot leave them alone. He fixes his eye on those around him, following each move and preserving it carefully in his journal. He begins to make plans on their behalf. Fanon says the native never stops achieving his freedom, and he gives us some times. For the poet, we can eliminate the time restriction. The poet never stops achieving. The politically committed poet never stops achieving his freedom. The contemporary black poet, insofar as it is possible to establish a central philosophy for any group of people, reflects both varying degrees of political motivation and various levels of political evolution. Many of us who created out of a compulsion to share our convictions, our new truths, out of an urgency to help create the dynamics of change for a black family nation, succeeded beyond any dream of success. Success is heady opiate, and some of us responded to recognition and discarded and denied our roles as political activists. But we cannot, in times of crises, afford to lose our clear vision. Ours is a very serious responsibility, one that has moral and ethical ramifications. It is my belief that a political poet is he who, having come to certain realizations, feels not only an obligation but a compulsion to call the people to view the subterranean and complex nature of their oppression and to share with them the substance of survival. In the past we have done that. We began in the 60s by enthusiastically embracing our charge. It became sun to us, and like manna of biblical times, it became sustenance. We were filled, as a matter of fact, with a zeal not unlike that of the early Christian martyrs. We threw traditional forms of thought and caution as well to the winds. We were holy in our zeal. We understood our responsibility. We knew what we had to do. We had to save black lives. We had to reclaim black minds. We demanded the erection of fine new black temples of body and spirit. Thematically, we used history as information, as directive. Satirical humor as statement. Music as compelling rhythm. Love as thematic foundation to encourage the growth of a nation. Shock and repetition as extremes to compel and emphasize the need for personal reassessment. And you heard all this. You heard it in the poems of Don L. Lee, in the poems of early Sonia Sanchez. We set about in the past returning the black image to black control. We generated ideological concepts and premises, reaffirmed, identified, and celebrated our heroes, deifying them, immortalizing the concepts which powered them, and enshrining them as permanent inspiration. We reevaluated the people, viewing them with new and unprecedented insight, with sensitivity, understanding ourselves as indivisible, and proclaiming that the problem of the individual is the problem of the group, and the welfare of the group the problem of the individual. If we have political direction, a great deal of the credit belongs to the poets and writers who exposed the lies, destroyed the myths, and caused us to see with greater clarity, who freed our minds. The protagonist in Ellison's Invisible Man says at one point, "When I know who I am, then I'll be free." Contemporary black poetry attempts to satisfy this imperative, tells us who we are, and shows us faces so familiar we often fail to recognize them. But we need more than information, and the political poet is compelled to be more than an aesthetic channel. Kiropetsikositsili, one of our finest poets, an African born on the continent and presently self-exiled from Johannesburg, says, "Clarity is more than a concept, it is a way of life." And I'll repeat that because it's an important credo. Clarity is more than a concept, it is a way of life. If you can internalize that, it'll simplify a lot of your problems. The poet we can conclude becomes the poem. If we need reassessment, it is to committed creativity. Committed creativity is not the product of demand, but of volition. And it's important to stress that, because all too often people say, well, how can people get away with telling the writer what he is to write? And who has authority to say to someone, you must write this way or you must write that way? No one. Categorically, no one has the right to tell anyone how he should write. I'd like to emphasize that committed creativity is not the product of demand, but of volition. Change is mandated for a society in which the people are adroitly programmed to disbelieve what they experience. And if you think that that is not so, and surely you do not, Just think of how long we were in a depression while we were assured that nothing was going to happen to the economy. It is not at all strange in this kind of society that a specific segment of the society can be programmed to accept premises formulated for the particular purpose of nurturing them in a climate that maintains and supports what usefulness that minority has, and which protects and reinforces the important and necessary vertical relationship of the oppressor and oppressed. It's important that the society maintain that relationship. It's vital if it is to survive. Thoughtful writing is the architecture of change, and writers, because their effect is so profound and far-reaching, must now be not only the designers of a new consciousness, but both voice and energy of a new black conscience. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I suggest that the further and immediate problem, in fact the real struggle of the 20th century, is the struggle of a specific people, we, the descendants of enslaved Africans, to develop an effective, liberating political ideology. We haven't done it yet. And that's what much of the inner conflict is about. And that the burden of propounding and disseminating the components of that ideology should be the sober concern of that creative artist who has no inner choice but to use his energy for political activism, whose nuclear weapon is committed black poetry. If you should see a man walking down a crowded street, talking aloud to himself, don't run in the opposite direction, but run toward him, for he is a poet, and you have nothing to fear from the poet but the truth. Now I'm going to read you some poetry. They built a schoolhouse where the children could come to be taught the calabash, the ono leaf, and mountain water, sparkling the compound. And they sat around it with guns, for it was a jewel, casting brilliances into the future. They sat around it with guns, for it was a jewel. You know, we talk a lot about alternative institutions, and I think that we need to understand that when alternative institutions begin to really become effective, because they will be jewels, they will also be threatening. I'm sorry, but a poet has to read what he feels like reading at the moment, and regardless of the order I've got them in, there are things that come to mind that I want to use, okay? How will you call me, brother, in the bad time? There is something that I'd like to add to the political poet. Certainly is concerned with the nuts and bolts of his craft, with idiom and imagery and diction and all of the things that go into making a fine poem a fine poem. I think that there is no impediment to combining craft and political commitment. It may work sometimes, and sometimes it may not work, but I think that is true of any poem. And I'm saying that to urge those of you who feel a commitment to issues, not to be frightened by the tremendous task of combining your creativity with your concern. It takes work, but I think it's worth it if you can make it work. This is a poem about communication and about the seriousness of a people, of a nation within a nation who do not control any means of communication. How will you call me, brother, in the bad time? I have been away so long I do not know the big drum's voice, and you have bought their murmuring for so many years. My voice is foreign in your ear. We own the night, but they own WHIT Radio, WHI TV, WHIT Union. In the moment when their poison blurs the sun, and the air is heavy in my nostrils, I will need the comfort of your blackness. How will you call me, brother, in the bad time? Have you armed your children and sent the old ones to the woods? Have you fled the concrete compounds for the safety of the night and felt the soft black of your cousin like a tree in turbulence beside you? How will you call me, brother, in the bad time? Like carcasses that have begun to stink, you have outlived their need. You fill the air with curses, and your foot is heavy in the land. They pull their face and hide beyond the opaque of their souls, gathering blessings to come forth armored in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, with an act of purification. How will you call me, brother, in the bad time? Black poets have identified their heroes, and I doubt if there is a black poet writing who does not have a poem that celebrates the energy and the commitment of El-Hajj Malik Shabazz. El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, who went through the changes and came out black and shining and pointed the way, who became a truth and a positive action and more than a voice in the wind, who became transformation we could see and touch, reality in spite of, who shouted his truths, whispered his challenges, dared a whole generation to use his strength, whose black spirituality was exploded into the air, and we inbreathed him, and he became a part of me, and you carry him in you, and he is restless and demands an action past rhetoric, an action that delivers itself, a love past sighing, a love that creates today, full of the knowledge of tomorrow and of what it will be unless we move to change it into what it must be. El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, who went through the changes and became a truth and a positive action and more than a voice in the wind. Black writers, we're often charged with writing didactic poetry, and we very proudly admit that we do. Black writers use history as directive, as information, and a few years ago I had an opportunity to do some research in the West on those ex-slaves who left the South and made their way to Kansas and Colorado, and who formed their own communities there, who suffered and nearly starved and froze to death, and in many instances did just that in those Kansas winters. And from that came 3 poems, all of them entitled Nicodemus. I hope you know about Nicodemus. It's one of the early all-black towns, and it grew side by side with a white town named Boley. And the issue for survival finally got to the point that someone had to decide, the governor of Kansas then, where the railway where the train was going to, which town the train would go through. There was tremendous competition in both towns for the train. One day, according to my research in the Historical Society there in Kansas, while the black men were in the fields working someplace, two white men from Boley came through Nicodemus with petitions and talked the people who were still home, many times the mother of the house, who had no notion what she was signing, into signing the petition to let the train go through Boley. So the train went through Boley. Boley prospered. Nicodemus went down to a slow death. However, there is still a vestige of Nicodemus, has a colorful history. There are still a few families living there, and from that I have these few poems. Mr. Suggs is all that is left of the dreams, all that is left of the vision of whispering Kansas wheat fields, pulsed by sweat and freedom laughs, harvested by 100 eager whip-scarred hands. Mr. Suggs, houses bent with remembering, and the vine-entombed AME church, stone more durable than the new-birthed men that stood it, a trio weather-grade. Mr. Suggs is all, is what remains, the dust from the dreaming, the opaque of clear vision, the wandering through timelessness, remembers no promise, contains no yesterdays, snuffs today contemptuously from his nostrils, scuffs laboriously toward tomorrow. Mr. Suggs, all that is left of the dreams, all that remains of the vision. This story is drawn from life. Polished bronze, this is the second of the Nicodemus pieces. Polished bronze, immovable. Before I read the poem, I should tell you something about the woman who is the character we've talked about in the poem. I sat in her one-room kitchen interviewing her for a television special that they were going to make. It's a tiny kitchen, and in the ceiling, hanging from the ceiling was a wasp's nest or hornet's nest. I don't know, to me they're equally bad. But inside this tiny room, they flew around in and out of the nest. It was an incredible situation, and after a while my nerves gave under it, and I asked her if she'd mind if we stepped out on the porch. It was, one of the things that was so strange and impossible for me to adjust to, that this woman lived with day by day and saw nothing unusual in. Our black experience is certainly not a homogeneous experience, and I learned a great deal when I was out in Kansas, including coming to a complete understanding of how people can stand that flat country. I think I'd love it. Polished bronze, immovable, gleamed by Kansas heat and energized by hate, aged in black 70 times past. Crystallized, she sees the dandied, languid cracker lounging, sees him whisk serenely through the windswept wheat fields, wheat sees him fire an idle malice, sees him kill the lean, lithe walker, Papa falling on his toolbox, box still crusted with his beauty. Nah, she ain't gonna talk to you, man. She don't want no interview. As a matter of fact, it is a true story. This grand old lady that I interviewed had this happen to her father when she was quite young. He had been shot as an idle malice by a man from the back of a train. He did die from loss of blood. And later, when the cameraman went out to film her for the TV special, she refused to be interviewed. And they called and said, would you go back out and interview her for the camera? And I refused to go back out because I thought she was entitled to her privacy. and this is the last of the Nicodemus pieces. Once again, using history as information, I'm sure all of you know what sod houses are. Those houses built from precisely that sod that was cut from the ground and piled again so that to provide some kind of rude shelter that would enable these ex-slaves to exist till the winter was over. Her first man cut the sod and builded with it her first house. And when he held her, his rough hands love-scratched her back, and fused her to him with his sweat, his strength. But winter claimed his flesh, and her next man brought songs and rings of fire for arms, and spun her head with his hot mouth. And in that house, the legend goes, she raised her 13 all alone, except for those who came and stayed to touch her with their eyes and take her with the throbbing that was all she ever knew of love. And in that kneeling house, the legend goes, she raised her 13 all alone. One that you might enjoy. There are some islands on the southeastern coast of the country known as the Georgia Sea Islands, and not too far away there is an island called Daufuskie. And there's a Daufuskie quartet. I'll read you one of them. Jake, the best dam kappen in the world, man. Oh, God, the best dam kappen in the world. Just been running the boat for the last 20 years. For the last 20 years. Oh, God. He boat turn over with he wife, you tell him. He ride the breakers sideways in the storm, smooth as my hand. They say that Jakin he can't swim. But he's the best dam kappen in the world. Oh, God, the best dam kappen in the world. If you have had your midnights, and they have drenched your barren guts with tears, I sing you sunrise and love and someone to touch. Thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to see if I can answer them. Okay. Okay, I'll wind it up then with the title poem from my book, I'm a Black Woman. I am a black woman. The music of my song, some sweet arpeggio of tears, is written in a minor key, and I can be heard humming in the night. Can be heard humming in the night. I saw my mate leap screaming to the sea, and I with these hands cupped the life breath from my issue in the canebrake. I lost Nat's swinging body in a rain of tears, and heard my son scream all the way from Anzio for peace he never knew. I learned Da Nang and Porkchop Hill in anguish. Now my nostrils know the gas, and these trigger-tired fingers seek the softness in my warrior's beard. I am a black woman, tall as a cypress, strong beyond all definition still, defying place and time and circumstance. Assailed, impervious, indestructible. Look on me and be renewed.
We'd like to remind you that the reception will be held at the Black Cultural Center.